So I wanted to bring this up. You write a lot about Jack Kirby, and there
Mm.
is a point when we're talking about the flavors of the occult or magic where you compare Jack Kirby's Kirbyean magic versus Crowley's magic,
Mm.
and you talk about the dangers of going over to Crowleyan magic. But what do you see as the difference? How would you compare and contrast those for people who don't really even know what Kirbyean magic might entail?
Well, let's get into this. Maybe we can use this for one of the clips. Jack Kirby is a very interesting case. Okay, so this is a guy grew up on the Lower East Side, went to war. Not only went to war, but when they found out that he could draw, they decided that he was going to, go behind enemy lines and sketch out everything he saw. He just became like a reconnaissance guy, which is like really dangerous job. He was sent home because he gotten frostbite so bad that they thought they were going to have to amputate his legs. Kind of like, I would say, pretty well into the spectrum. Okay, so this is, there are a lot of interesting recipes here, and was very successful in the comics in the 40s, much less so in the 50s. Kind of got blacklisted from DC, which was like the prestige house. Ended up at Marvel, which was like, that was like people started and ended their careers at Marvel. You know what I mean? It was like pretty much the bottom drawer of the industry at that point in time. I mean, Stan Lee had an office that was like an 8. Marvel Comics for a long time was like an 8x10 office in the Empire State Building. You know what I mean? Just like this little, just nobody. Just fly by night has been company. So Kirby ends up there because he had some business dealings that got him blacklisted from DC, and just was incredibly productive. But at some point in the mid 60s, almost literally overnight, his work just went from being like kind of clunky, but cool, kind of stylish, but it was obvious that he was just drawing too many pages a day, to everything like overnight, just everything being like cosmic and like everything's like pulsating with energy, and everything's like plasma, and like everything is cosmic, and everything is like the gods and space and ancient astronaut. I mean, he was doing ancient astronaut stuff in the late 50s, right? And I wrote about this in the book, but about 30 years ago, a friend of mine who was also a big Kirby fan said to me, I think he dropped acid in the 60s. And I was like, what? Like, what are you, crazy? And it's like, no, I mean, he's like, look what happened. It's like practically overnight, it just goes from like, run of the mill comic book stuff to being like completely psychedelic, tripped out insanity. And I was like, it took me a long time to sort of wrap my head around. Like, I think it took me about 15 years to sort of even start to entertain that notion. But here's the thing. So this is a guy, GI Bill, VA hospitals, right? I think a guy like him was probably a pretty good candidate for having like major PTSD, right? Going behind the lines in wartime Europe. Incredibly stressful, incredibly dangerous. There were stories that, I don't know if they're apocryphal, but that he was captured by the Nazis at one point with his crew, his little platoon, and they had to sort of fight their way out of it. He's the kind of guy that you can imagine just showing up, like he was living on Long Island at the time, like just going to some VA hospital and saying, "Oh, doc, I just can't get these thoughts out of my head. I had like a really tough time during the war." And they're like, "Jack, don't worry about it. Here, take this. Just put this under your tongue. It's a little piece of paper. Just put it on your tongue. Just lie down. We're going to turn the lights off. Maybe put a little nice music on. Just relax." And then all of a sudden it's just like, just like complete insanity like you've never seen. I mean, this stuff is like, Kirby stuff is like more psychedelic than like the actual psychedelic artists were. You know what I mean? His stuff was more just naturally insane like that. And then he moves to L.A. and he's living next door to Frank Zappa, of all people, and he's hanging out with Frank Zappa. They get together and they smoke cigarettes and just shoot the bull. I really think that somewhere along the line, like somebody just slipped him something, or maybe a little bit more than just something. You know what I mean? Like maybe he was part of this whole experimental process, because talk about a perfect candidate for it. But he channeled it all onto the page, right? And he put it all. So many, if people aren't familiar with who we're talking about, I mean, this is the guy who co-created Captain America, Iron Man, Hulk, Thor. He's actually involved in an earlier iteration of Doctor Strange. He was involved in an earlier iteration of Spider-Man. So he was like either the creator or co-creator of all these characters, these billion-dollar characters that were basically keeping the lights on in Hollywood for the past 20 years. And he had a hand in it. And he also, like I said before, his ideas were just ransacked wholesale for Star Wars. And if you start to look, like I said, and you can just see it, you can just go online and just see like how like one cover just like this kind of clunky but stylized superhero stuff, and then the next, like literally the next issue was like, you know what I mean? And so his form of magic, that I would say, I mean, it's purely instinctual, and whatever might have happened to him, but there's a lot of trauma involved in there. And we've talked a lot about when I sort of came to this realization about MK Ultra not being what they thought it was, that the sort of trauma aspect was very much like shamanic initiation, or whatever the terminology you're supposed to use for that is now. I don't know, medicine man, holy man, whatever. How they take these kids, basically teenage boys, and just traumatize the hell out of them, break their brains so they can quote unquote cross into the other world. Well, I mean, Kirby had that happen to him because of his environment and his upbringing, the time that he, is in this very violent and crowded and dirty and dangerous neighborhood in the Lower East Side, and then he ends up going to war and being volunteered for the most dangerous job you can imagine. So I think that all these things just sort of broke it open. It broke open the skull. You know what I'm saying? And out of that, it's like he became a conduit, a channel for all these, for lack of a better term, gods.
Yeah.
Well, you know what I mean? And he was obsessed with the whole, like, he had this whole thing with like the new gods and everything like that. I mean, he was obsessed with these ideas. And like I said, he had been doing ancient astronaut stories 10 years before Chariots of the Gods. So this, I mean, he was like way ahead of the curve. But I think more and more, I'm more and more comfortable. Like, it's only taken me 30 years to become comfortable with the idea that, yeah, they were probably sitting him down at some VA hospital, in Levittown or something, dosing him up, It's, I wasn't familiar with this whole world. I'll tell you another story though. So, this is back in the 90s, and I was on my couch and I had a sort of a stack of Jack Kirby comics, the Eternals comics, which is this big ancient astronaut series. And I was watching this thing on the Discovery Channel. This is way back in the day when they'd actually show interesting things. And I think it was called like Entheogenic Ancient Astronauts or Entheogenic Aliens or something. And it talked about this whole process that these, like these ayahuasca shaman, they'd dose up. And if they were doing artwork, they'd start drawing like figures, and then they start drawing like all these little dots and then all these little squiggles, right? And if like you're familiar with Kirby's artwork, like dots and squiggles are a big part of it. So it's just like, I remember watching that and just being like, I had this just like an incredible epiphany. I'm like, holy shit. But like I said, it took me a number of years after that to not think that it was just, some sort of natural process of the mind, which I don't believe anymore. But there you go.
Yeah, well, I like the use of the word conduit because
Mm,
you called Jack Kirby an astro-Gnostic. You mentioned that
mm,
ancient astronaut theory is a theme in several of his works. And
mm.
I wanted to bring up this more obscure one that you talk about, Devil Dinosaur, and one of its arcs. It's another comic I'd never heard of. You say this story has ancient parallels in the teachings of the more esoteric Gnostic cults. And it's
Mm.
basically a Gnostic Garden of Eden story. But can you break down this demon tree arc for people as a good case study and seeing the kind of seeding that Kirby did of this stuff in from a pretty obscure place to putting it right in his art in a strange way?
All right. So, towards the end of his career at Marvel, they were asking him to sort of create ideas for like Saturday morning cartoons, and Devil Dinosaur was one of them. And Devil Dinosaur was like the stupidest thing. It was just like this little ape boy who's friends with this big red dinosaur. They run around, like whatever the chronology is, like where apes supposed to coexist with dinosaurs. I don't know, whatever. It was just an excuse to sort of come up with this idea for Saturday morning cartoon. Well, Kirby being Kirby, he did like a couple just random stories, and then he did this arc where these aliens, not only aliens but robotic aliens, so like AI aliens, come down in these saucers, and they see these little proto-hominid ape people running around, and they're like, "Oh, we're gonna mess around with them," So it's just like classic, uh, Zechariah Sitchin kind of AAT stuff. And it's in this comic book that's supposed to be meant for like young kids, right? And then he had this storyline where the the spaceship is destroyed, right, with all these robots in this fight with the dinosaurs and so on, and all that's kind of left is this like motherboard, almost like this fragment of the computer, but it has like a voice chip and everything like that, and it speaks and so on, and they call it the demon tree. And the demon tree creates this dome and like captures these 8 people in it, right? And like it's like Adam and Eve, but there's these other characters, sort of random other 8 people running around. And Devil, Moon Boy, who's Devil Dinosaur's little buddy, is sort of imprisoned there, and Devil Dinosaur sort of breaks them all out of this dome, this garden that they're all being imprisoned by the demon tree. So it's really just like straight up Gnostic retelling of Adam and Eve. It's straight up like this is not really, it descended, so it's like the whole descent of the archons and so on. The spaceship comes down and it's destroyed, but it leaves this remnant, and the remnant is trying to carry on the work and control the course of biology and human development and so on. And they're liberated by the devil, right? So those you've heard, these Gnostic stories that the serpent, who is never identified as Satan in the actual text itself, which is very interesting. But the serpent was the liberator. So the Sethians and the Ophites, these particular Gnostic cults, had this belief system that the serpent wasn't the devil, but it was actually Christ. Like the serpent was actually an incarnation of Christ who came to liberate Adam and Eve from their imprisonment by the demiurge.
Mm-hmm. And you
And
note that in the original text, there's a line about the snake being relegated to slithering around on its body, which
mm,
suggests that there was a prior time when it had arms and legs, much like a dinosaur. So you
Yes.
got the moon child and the snake dinosaur from the Garden of Eden running around. And another part that I liked was you say, we have this Garden of Eden story according to a Gnostic interpretation, with the demiurge being the fragment of a broken alien computer. And just like the demiurge, the demon tree claims to be omnipotent and all-knowing and imprisons its subjects. Note that even the name demon tree isn't all that far removed from demiurge, nor is moon boy that far from moon child. And so all these things are right there.